7. Someone once warned me that a 5-minute chat with the rat would end up costing you 100 coal. I wondered how many times that would happen for me to learn my lesson. I trudged back to the forest, shoulders slumped. Every once in a while, I stopped to open my window and ensure I was moving in the right direction. In the last 4 days, I'd mapped almost 90% of the forest. Getting back to the Dark Elf camp didn't require a map by now, but that wasn't my destination. I set down the coordinates in the center of the forest of Wavering Mist, which covered the southern half of the floor, and made my careful way to them. I was not heading to the town of Zumfoot, or the Queen Spider's cave, but the large forest elf encampment to which the imposter soldier had fled. I couldn't bemoan my carelessness now. This was the real point of my solo night expedition. I had experienced infiltration in the 6th quest of the campaign during the beta. To complete it, I had to steal a scroll of orders from a forest elf camp. In it were top secret commands from the leader of the forest elves, who was situated in their home base at the north end of the forest. Having done it before, I knew the content of that top secret mission to use the disguising charm and steal the jade key from the dark elf base. If that mission failed, the agent was to wait for reinforcements and lead an assault on the base. In the beta, I was in a party of 4, with another 4 hired dark elves, and we led a midnight assault on the camp, killing all enemy soldiers to steal those orders. If I tried to complete this quest with Asana, Kismel, and some soldiers from the base, we would probably have to use the same method. But now, I felt a strong resistance to that idea. I didn't want to force Asana and Kismel to kill a number of forest elves in their sleep, even if they were our foes. I knew that was illogical, meaningless, emotional reaction. It wasn't easy to imagine that if I completed the quest on my own and informed Asana of the fact, she would be furious. I could have explained it all to her, attempted to convince her, but Asana, and likely Kismel as well, would have resisted my request that she stay back at the base. And the way I intend to beat the quests was only possible alone. My idea was not to steal it by the sword. I was going to sneak into the camp by myself and take it through stealth. Now that a single fatal mistake was permanent, I couldn't just revive myself at Black Iron Palace. It was the height of stupidity to take such a risk on nothing more than an emotional reaction. Even worse, this quest had no bearing on clearing this floor and furthering the ultimate goal of freedom. But even if I hadn't teamed up with Asana on the 2nd floor and had adventured alone on the 3rd floor instead, which easily could have happened on a whim, I would still be tackling this campaign quest alone. I'd have to complete the quest to steal the orders as a solo player anyway. I had plans. Based on the title of Infiltration, one assumed that the quest had been designed for a player to beat it without drawing his sword. By the end of the beta, the orthodox strategy was for a player to be good at hiding skill, to sneak in, do the job alone. At this point in time, my level and skill proficiency was far above what the quest required. On the other hand, there was no guarantee I wouldn't cause an accident of some kind and be forced to fight in the entire camp on my own. But after the week and 5 days I'd spent with Asana on the last 2 floors, I understood that my personal values were shifting. In the past, I cared for nothing but effective mob farming, quick quest completion, and maximum money and experience gain. That was what I needed to tackle the ultimate goal of winning my freedom. Fixed parties and background stories of quests were extraneous stuff that only got in my way. But what if there was something here just as important as efficiency? I couldn't express what this thing might be in words yet, but here I was, hiking through the woods at night alone, for that mysterious sake. Something I treasured enough to open myself to incredible risk. Despite being lost in thought, I managed to travel over a mile without drawing the attention of any nocturnal mobs, and arrived at my destination just before 1 o'clock. The Forest Elf Advance Camp was located atop a hill looking over a river that ran through the Forest of Wavering Mists from the east to west. There was only one entrance to the semicircular fence that surrounded the camp. There were guards manning the entrance, of course. My hiding skill was woefully inadequate to sneak through them without detection. I might be able to bump a hide rate number a quick bit with Kismel's Mist Moon Cloak, but from what she told me, it did not work quite as well against other elves. I suppose that was why forest elves had to use disguises to sneak into the dark elf base. A similar invisibility cloak would not have done the trick. So infiltration via the entrance was off the table. The bridle fence, made of dead, whitened wood, would split with a deafening crack when pushed against, so climbing was not an option either. But as a proper beater, I knew the way in. Of course. If I descended to the river, a safe distance away from the camp, and snuck along the waterside, I could position myself before the tent with the item I needed. There was a sheer cliff over 20 feet tall from the foot of the canyon to the top of the hill. But there were roots conveniently placed just so an opportunistic climber could scale the wall, as long as he wasn't outfitted with heavy armor, theoretically. If I managed to pull this off, I could sell that nugget of info to Argo for the second volume of her Elf War Guide. Lynn's guild was the only other people attempting the campaign for now, but the information would be very useful to those who wanted to catch up to the frontline team. I circled the hill from the south to the west and found a relatively gentle slope that would take me down to the foot of the cliff. I stared out at the pleasant gushing river, spotting the occasional shadow of a large fish beneath the surface. I was in the mood to fish one up and salt and grill it, but I didn't have the fishing or cooking skill. That reminded me of Asana's hobby tailoring skill, but I had to scold myself for getting distracted during a mission. I steadily slipped along the rocky shore. After about 10 yards along the water, aided by nothing but a pale silver moonlight, I came to a dead stop. It felt like someone was watching me. I scanned the surroundings, but there was no silhouette of a man, beast, or insect, either in front, behind, or above. The idea that I could feel someone's gaze was even more impossible in Aincrad than in real life. Detecting other players and moving objects in the game required direct visual, auditory, olfactory signals from nerve gear. It was absolutely impossible to notice that someone was watching. Even still, I couldn't move. I was held still by a dread chill, something I'd felt several times since being trapped in this game of death. I continued to look around, rooted to the spot. In the end, what made the difference, possibly between life and death, was the spotting bonus mod I'd earned reaching skill level 100 in search. As the name suggested, this mod made it easier to find hiding targets. As my gaze swept from right to left, I detected a vague, shifting outline in the shadows of the far bank. I stared hard at the spot, wide-eyed. If someone was hiding there, my constant gaze would be dropping their hide rate. But if I was focusing on the wrong spot, my would-be attacker could slip around my backside and catch me by surprise. For 10 seconds, I concentrated on the far bank, resisting the urge to turn around. Suddenly, color bloomed within the shadow. A figure appeared as though from the cliff itself. The mod was meant to help me against the forest elves, but the cursor that appeared over the figure was not the yellow of an NPC or the red of a monster, but the green of a player. After the cursor, I saw a dark gray scale mail. I did not appear to be metallic, but close-fitting scales that clung to his torso and gleamed wetly. His gloves and boots were made of the same material. a long sword at his left hip, and dangling from his head and shoulders a fine chainmail coif. "You," I growled. It was him. The man I saw in Lynn's party 3 days earlier, which I had just learned was named Morte. But why would he be here in the middle of the night, all alone? No, there was something more important than that. Mort was hiding, and he stayed hidden as I entered the canyon. Hiding itself was not a crime. I did the exact same thing when Kambao's party passed by the Queen Spider dungeon. But Mort did not happen to be here, and then hastily hid when he noticed me coming. If that was the case, I'd have noticed him first. Thanks to the search distance bonus mod I earned at skill level 50, or at the very least, he'd have detected each other simultaneously. No, Moore had been hiding here all along. He expected someone to come through this passage at the foot of the hill behind the camp. Someone had to be pursuing elf war quests. On the side of the Dark Elves, only 2 people on the 3rd floor currently fit that description. Me and Asana. He was waiting for us. Pure, righteous fire must have poured out of my eyes in that moment of understanding. Just 20 feet away, his right hand twitched. But in the next instant, a bright, cheery voice that completely out of place broke the silence. "Well, it looks like I got spotted." Just a bit louder, his voice would have been inaudible in the camp above. He lifted his fish-scale gloves and made a show of pretend applause, without actually making a clapping noise. "Pretty good job. I've never been revealed like that at this distance, in this kind of darkness. And you totally spotted me on the sheer hunch, not with your eyes at first, right? You don't have some kind of sixth sense extra skill, do you?" His voice contained a both playful, boyish innocence and a grating theatricality. He was about my height and size, but I couldn't see his face due to the coif that hung down his nose. On a closer look, the border of that metal hood was torn and ragged, with fine tendrils of chain that hung down like locks of hair. It was probably just the design of the item, not a sign of wear and tear, but it looked creepy at the time. "You're Morte from the DKB?" He had been using reasonably polite speech, so I could have just stood and returned the level of courtesy, but I wasn't in the mood. After learning that he'd been trying to spy on me, the man didn't seem to be bothered by my burlesque response. "You get your info quick for not hanging around town at all. Yup, my name's Morte. Guess you could say naming's not my forte." I recoiled a bit at his slimy evasion of my curiosity. I'd never run across someone of his type in SAO. Klein had been a breezy, light-hearted guy before the game turned deadly, but compared to him, this Morte fellow was completely inscrutable. He bowed politely, dangling chains jingling. I took a step towards him. "I don't suppose I need to introduce myself. Seemed clear you were hiding with the expectation that I'd pass through the area." "Why do you make it sound like I was waiting to ambush you, Kirito?" he said casually, indicating that he knew my name. There was a wide grin on his face, but as usual, I couldn't see his eyes. "Sounds like that's what you were doing," I accused, barely holding back the bite I felt rising to my throat for reasons unknown. Morte's smile never wavered, but he shuffled his shoulders in some strange mockery of a dance. "Well, you got me then." "Was it on Lynn's orders?" "You know, he's got potential, I'll admit. But no, this was my decision. I mean, Lynn's not a beater. He's just wouldn't understand. How could he know that you'd pass by this river to sneak into the camp? But you did know, which means you were a beta tester too. Just call me a beater. It's a stupid nickname, but that's what I like about it. Did you know that beater is a name for a kitchen implement in English? Like for beating eggs. Makes you want to whip everything in this game up into a froth. Even at low volume, his bubbly voice was crystal clear, and you made steadfastly polite. So why did I find it all so annoying? I took a step back, intending to demonstrate that I would not put up with his silly chatter without a point. If you were waiting for me, then get to the point. As I know you're aware, I've got a quest to complete. Gosh, this Elf War quest really takes me back. I hear that only 3 people managed to complete the whole quest line in the beta, including you. I ran out of time before I could finish. Morte held up his hands in a panic as I started to turn my heel. Whoa, hang on, friend. I'll tell you what I want, what I'm asking for. Asking for? That's right. Look, here's the deal. I'm asking if you can forget about this quest and turn back. I stared at him in stunned silence, then shrugged my shoulders. Then, as theatrically as he had earlier, you know I'm not going to turn back now. What does it have to do with you? The DKB's working the Forest Elf side of the campaign, right? One of the basic rules of the Elf War quest was that each party proceeded individually. The main bases of either side were instanced maps, and it was impossible for Party A completing quests on the Dark Elf storyline to somehow disadvantage Party B as they worked the Forest Elf story. Yes, the individual quests sometimes overlapped at non-instance locations, such as the Spider Cave earlier and this camp now, so that multiple parties could be in the same place at the same time. But with a bit of waiting, everyone could complete their goals safely. Besides, Lynn's team was on the Forest Elf side, so they wouldn't even get the quest to steal the commander's orders. So whether I completed the quest or not, it would have no effect on Morte's or the DKB. But Morte simply grinned, jangling the metal threads of his hood, and wagged an index finger back and forth. Actually, it is my business. I'm afraid I can't actually explain how it is, though. I mean, if I could do that, I wouldn't have been hiding, would I? What? I nearly overlooked the menace hidden within his statement. My eyes narrowed. You're saying that you weren't hiding in order to call out to me and negotiate, but to interfere and stop me by force? Why, that would be silly of me. I mean, I'd get tagged as an orange player if that was the case. That would be awfully easy way to get kicked out of the guild I just joined. He said, waving his hips back and forth, but the menace returned with his next statement. The thing is, I won't get flagged for just performing a song, see? I really like singing. You understand. If they had karaoke in one of these towns, I'd be hanging out there all the time. What are you? I wondered. Eyes narrowed. Then I understood. Morte was threatening to cause a racket as I was trying to infiltrate the camp. The dozen or so elven warriors sleeping in their tents would immediately burst out, ready to fight. If I was spotted by that many foes at once, it would be difficult to escape. If I was unlucky and they surrounded me. So you're trying to MPK me, I murmured, remembering what happened 40 days before. The face of the man who had tried to kill me remotely through a monster trap steadily faded from my memory, replaced by Morte's. But the mysterious beta tester didn't play up his devious plot. He grinned disarmingly. "Oh, I'm not suggesting something that awful. I mean, you'd be able to slip right out of their grasp, wouldn't you? All I'm asking you is to hold off on the quest for a day." A day? What difference will a day make? Well... He slowly held up his hands and made an X over his mouth with his index finger. "Sorry, that's a secret, but you'll understand come tomorrow. All I'm asking you to do is go back from wherever you're hanging out for tonight." And if I refuse? I was getting tired of his slimy, smarmy nature. I wanted this meeting over with. Morte took the fingers off his mouth and pointed them directly at me instead. "Why don't we settle it the way we did in the beta? You remember how the guild members would settle disputes, don't you?" "With a coin toss?" "But you wouldn't accept that result, would you?" "No, I'm talking about the other way. The cool and exciting way." It took me 2 seconds to realize what Morte was suggesting. For another 2 seconds, I glared at the swordsman on the far bank. When I spoke, my voice was low and as gravelly as it could go. "Are you being serious?" "Oh, my serious switch is always on, partner." He lowered his left index finger and used it to trace the pommel of the anneal blade at his waist. That settled it. Morte was proposing a duel. The idea of a dueling system itself was not new to MMORPGs. Many games that otherwise removed the ability to PK implemented a dueling system, where 2 players could agree to fight. In SAO, PKing was legal outside the towns, but anyone who committed PK became a criminal, which turned their cursors from green to orange and prevented them from entering town. Duels, on the other hand, were legal anywhere and involved no crimes. They happened with wild frequency in the beta as a test of strength or a means of setting scores. But once the real-tail game came out, I had never challenged or been challenged to a duel. Even in the duel, when a player's HP reached 0, he was dead, which meant that today's Eincrad, if we duel, one of us will die. Morte practically squirmed in delight at my observation. "Well, Kirito, if you insist..." Kidding. I mean, a complete duel would be super dangerous, right? "Oh, but it's much safer in the half-finish mode. That way, the duel ends as soon as one of us gets to the yellow zone." "A lot milder, if you ask me." Aside from the full finish mode, in which duel continued until one player's HP reached 0, there was a half finish mode, where an HP bar down to 50% ended the duel, and a first strike mode, where the first clean hit won the match. Unsurprisingly, the over before you blinked first strike mode and the unsatisfying half finish mode were rarely ever used in the beta. I'd forgotten they even existed. But as Morte said, half-finished duel would not result in death. It was dangerous to allow yourself to lose 50% of your HP at the very numerical embodiment of life in Eincrad. But if I refused, Morte could make a good of his promise to shout and disrupt my quest. Then again, even if I dueled him and won, he could still break his word and shout anyway. "Is there any guarantee that if you lose, you won't interfere with me?" I demanded, staring into the darkness beneath the coif. "Oh, I wouldn't pull a dirty trick like that. If I broke my word, I'd be too mortified to show my face again. But let's say I lose. Then my HP would be at 50%, It'll take a while for a healing potion to kick in, and I wouldn't be able to shout because the long ears in the camp might hear, and some other mobs might try to approach from behind. It was a weak guarantee. I had the choice of not exposing myself to needless danger and swallowing Morte's condition for today. There was no reason I had to complete this infiltration quest tonight. According to the roadmap, Gabao had set up a strategy meeting. This was the day, now that midnight had passed, that we started on the labyrinth, and in 2 days, he would be challenging the boss. There was plenty of time for questing. But if I left the camp then, I would never know Morte's motive for staking out this location. It was easy for a beta tester to assume that if I didn't show up in town, I was busy with the Elf War quest, but it was impossible to predict with such accuracy that I'd be visiting this camp on this night. It would be one thing if he bought the information from Argo, but I had just met her, and she would have offered to sell me the fact that Morte's bought my info. That made it highly likely that Morte was waiting in this spot. Without taking my eyes off him, I slammed the yes button. The sub window shifted and began 60 seconds countdown. During the beta, many complained that the full timer before a duel was overkill, but the development team made no moves to shorten the timer while the test was running. Despite not having dueled in months, the timer still felt long to me. I drew my Neilblade +8 and held it in the orthodox mid-level stance, spread my legs front to rear. But Mortes showed no sign of drawing his blade, despite the active countdown. He just stood there, watching. Just as I began to wonder what he was up to, it hit me. I had accepted his challenge without a second thought. The most important factors for survival in SAO were knowledge and experience. I had been in countless duels in the beta. I had acute knowledge of which skills were the best for one-on-one fight against a player and how to use them. But this was different. A duel in the official release of SAO where the stakes were deadly. And I had never once tried to duel in these circumstances. Morte probably had been active in dueling since the change. He might have done it dozens of times. He knew something I didn't know. And based on that knowledge, he was simply staring at me, learning what he could from my stance and my location to draw his sword until the last moment. Nobody did that in the beta. We groaned over the length of a timer, chatting with any onlookers, waiting with boredom, then unleashing our best sword skill as soon as the timer hit 0. That was the duel I knew. But after the moment, 43 days before that changed, everything the old way went out of the window. 60 seconds, a span of time allotted to observe the enemy and formulate a strategy. I glanced back down at the window, hovering in front of my chest. The countdown was around 45 seconds remaining. Back to Morte. He stood straight, swaying slightly. I gleaned nothing from his stance. In comparison, I had my Neilblade held out in front of me, crouched slightly, center of weight leaning forward. What did he see in my stance? How would he read and react to my first movement? I could change my stance, but would that just give him more information instead? I checked the counter. 35 seconds. The endless timer from the beta seemed to be ticking twice for every actual second now. There was no time for thinking. Could I signal a pause or request a do-over? No, I wasn't that shameless. And once the timer started, the duel was inevitable. I realized that I was losing my cool and starting to panic. But the first bead of virtual sweat trickled down my forehead. 25 seconds left. Perhaps I should give up on striking first and see what he did instead. There was 15 feet of water separating us. It was certainly shallow enough to cross, but I could easily fall in and tumble just from running through it. To say nothing of Striking with my sword, Morte wouldn't just rush across the water. But hang on. 15 feet could be crossed quickly with Sonic Leap skill. And if used right, the counter ended, there wouldn't be enough time to escape the accuracy range of the sword skill. Fortunately, Sonic Leap started with a high stance, and I had the blade held at neutral, so he wouldn't know how I was going to use it. 10 seconds left. The countdown started to beep audibly with each second. 5 seconds. Morte finally drew his sword. His anneal blade had a slick gleam to it, the sign that he'd put a lot of work into upgrading it. 4 seconds. Morte swung the sword into a carelessly high stance. The blade started glowing a light green, the sign that he was about to use the sword skill. The stance and color meant Sonic Leap. 3 seconds. Was his plan the same as mine? But the counter wasn't over yet. Hitting the opponent during the countdown to a duel outside the safe haven of town was considered a criminal act. His cursor would go orange. 2 seconds. If I was going to evade, I had to jump either side now, but I stayed pointed right at Morte and raised my sword to a high position. He probably intended to hold the promotion of the sword until he got to the countdown finished. But he started far too early. He was going to cancel out before the duel began. 1 second. But just as a counter read 0, 1, Morte leapt off the ground. The high-speed slash screamed across the water, green trail reflecting off the surface. Then I understood. There was no need to wait until 0 to let the skill fly. If the blade hit the opponent's avatar and caused damage, even a mere 0.001 seconds after the bell, it would not set off the criminal code. Mort understood that well and timed his move perfectly. 0. The purple duel sign appeared over the river, but I did not see it. Mort's body, like some dark, monstrous bird, blocked my view. I was planning to use Sonic Leap when the duel began, but that naive plan of mine was ultimately what saved me from the ignoble result of defeat simultaneous to the start of the match. Because I had my nail blade held up, not yet in the motion of the skill, I just managed to turn it flat and absorbs Morte's attack in time. If he had hit me right in the head, it would have been stunned me and not consumed half my health right in one go, and left me unable to stop the follow-up attack. A tremendous shock ran through both my hands. Right gripping the handle, left pushed against the flat of the blade for support. Players' sword skill had a special weight to them that far outclassed monster attacks. But he didn't just rely on the system assistance for speed and power, but jumped and swung downward for extra momentum. Orange sparks and green light exploded just inches from my eyes, clouding my vision. Long swords were among the hardier one-handed weapons, but they had a weakness. If a powerful shock hit the flat side of the blade head-on, there was a chance the weapon's durability to drop to 0 at once. The resulting destruction to the item? My sword creaked unpleasantly as it blocked Morte's Sonic Leap. But the faithful partner who had held fast since the first day of the game did not give. The blow was powerful, that it hadn't just upgraded the durability stat to +4, it might have broken. Gah! I grunted, gritted my teeth, waiting for the enemy's sword to finish skill. If I could withstand the blow fully, Morte's would be left in a brief, vulnerable pause. The light exploding before my eyes grew steadily weaker, bit by bit. But just before the skill was finished, my right foot, planted in soft ground off the riverbank, finally gave in to the pressure and slipped. My body sank abruptly, and I had to leap backward to avoid falling. At the exact same moment, the glow left Morte's blade. As soon as I landed, I leapt forward. When his pause ended, Morte lifted his sword again. After the 2 shouts and a single clash, twice, then 3 times, the night forest rang with the eerie, resonant clang of of two copies of the same exact blade striking with force. Even without the benefit of a sword skill, Morte's talent with the blade was considerable. He wasted no effort with his swings, aiming for my critical points with the shortest possible movements. I had to parry, sidestep, desperately just to block these unique attacks, somewhere between the slashes and thrusts. He had the clear upper hand in the number of strikes, but that suited me fine. The more I concentrated on the battle, the quicker the remnants of the ugly panic faded. Once my mind was as honed as a steel trap, I would be ready for the counterattack. Furious at the failure of his surprise attack, Morte emitted a blood-curdling screech and thrusts at my heart. Thrusts were difficult to parry due to the precise timing required, but they were much easier to sidestep. I stepped forward to my right, tilting sideways, and swept my blade from left to right as I evaded the sword point. My sword, upgraded to a +4 sharpness, cut through the fish scale armor and knocked down Morte's HP bar for the first time. It wouldn't have been enough damage to win even under the first strike rules, but at least I finally had the advantage. Tch! Morte leaped backward, hissing in anger. Finally, that cocky leer was gone from his lips. If I let him take his distance, he might come back with another unexpected trick. I darted after him, keeping within sword range. Morte attempted more of his thrusting swings, but I calmly dodged and reflected each one. As Morte retreated, still attacking, his boots hit water. I didn't have time to look at the ground, but I knew I pushed him against the river. If I had more pressure on him, I could lure him into another major attack. And if I evaded that, I could actually use a sword skill to finish him off. A large splash sounded nearby, but it was not Morte falling into the water. In fact, he was already quite deep into the river. His right leg had just kicked up a wave of water. A sheet of tiny droplets danced before my eyes. He was using his blinding water attack to either flank me or launch a counterattack. I retreated quickly, staying away from the droplets and watching Morte closely. Beyond the spray of the water, I caught a flash of purple. It was not a sword skill. I had no idea what he was doing, opening his menu in the midst of a duel. But that was not possible with his sword in his right hand. I didn't see in his left hand either. Perhaps he returned it to its sheath? No, not that either. He must have dropped it into the river, but had to open his window to get a new one. But I wasn't kind enough to let this opportunity pass. I held my sword high overhead, screaming with animal aggression, and the same instant, a faint swishing hit my ears. That sound was familiar. By the time I realized what it was, I couldn't stop the slash already in progress. The flying sheet of droplets finally reached its peak and began to fall. On the other side, Mort's left hand had a round shield that hadn't been there a second before. It was of a similar, unusual design, but its spun metal luster spoke faithfully to its quality as an item. My sword descended and struck Mort's shield dead center, penetrating a vivid clash effect. We both staggered back as we pushed by the sparks of collision. I desperately fought back against the virtual inertia, stopping to recover even a tenth of a second faster than my foe. No matter how familiar Morte was with the menu, he couldn't possibly have opened his equipment stream and hit left hand icon, then picked out the shield from his inventory when it appeared. All that in a brief amount of time. The swish sound I'd heard was none other than the quick change mod that allowed him to flip to a preset equipment loadout with a single button, which meant the shield wasn't the only thing in his hand now, but I couldn't see his right hand, as it was held behind his body, but it must have been clutching a new sword. The instant he recovered his footing, Morte would launch a counterattack. I tried my hardest to tilt to my right within a stagger animation, hoping to evade his attack and deliver my own counterattack. In SAO, the book of shield users was to flank them, use the shield to the side. In the ultimate first-person combat game, the shield was both trusty source of defense and a wall that blocked eyesight. Nobody won a duel by doing nothing more than defending. This was basic information I'd learned back in the beta, but the basics were useful in any situation. Back from his delay just a step before me, Morty twisted lips openly and admitted a fierce shriek. So! His gauntleted hand stuck like a black viper. I expected one of those vertical thrust slices, so I jumped on my left foot, sidestepping to the right. His round shield rose upward with his thrust attacking motion, and I tried to swipe a counter below it. Whoosh! A dull, heavy roar cut the air. Mort's right hand was not clutching a sword, and his swing trajectory was not vertical. It was an axe, a dense blade at the end of a handle over 2 feet long. I recognized that individual type of axe. A harsh hatchet. He spun like a top, axe whirling on the flat plane of my left flank. I couldn't dodge to defend. The dark head of the axe struck me squarely on the side, the exact same spot I'd hit Morty just a moment earlier. The blow was heavy enough to lift me off the ground and took me away close to 20% of my health, as well as knocking me into another stagger. The overwhelmingly powerful two-hand axe was a favorite for many players, but its one-handed counterpart was something of a niche weapon. Its power was equal to that of one-handed swords, but without the benefit of a thrust attack. Its greatest bonus was its severe delaying effects its heavy attacks inflicted, but it was very hard to land them, unless you used a different weapon to lure in the opponent into thinking you would only use thrusts. That is. I grunted, coming again to a belated realization. Morty's repeated spamming of the sword thrust was nothing but a feint to set up his axe blow. If true, this meant that this harsh hatchet has his true main weapon, not the anneal blade. This was not an idle experiment without an actual weapon skill behind it. He would come after me with a sword skill next. Morty's entire body twisted back on itself like some kind of rubber toy. The axe, held back at its maximum tension, began to glow red. With an unearthly screech, Morte unleashed the two-strike one-handed axe skill, Double Cleave. At nearly invisible speed, the axe rotated twice, striking my chest and stomach at nearly the same time. I blew backward like a pile of rags from what felt like an explosion within my body, slammed into a boulder, and fell to the ground. The stun icon flashed, and my field of vision blinked and blacked out in spots. My HP bar began to drop precariously, stopping only before the halfway mark. The stun effect itself lasted only 3 seconds, but I still couldn't stand. A freezing chill stole into me from the 2 spots where I had been hit, the glowing red with damage effects. Even my fingers and toes felt numb. I crawled on all fours. A pair of fish-scale patterned boots lazily approached. The owner of those boots stopped just 6 feet away, and I looked up to see, within the dim shadow of the coif, glinted his eyes for the first time. "Ooh," came his voice, slick and derisive. "That's a shocker. Still not in yellow after all that? You're good. This axe is upgraded to be +6 to heaviness. You know that? It can even slice through plate armor." As Morte continued on his smarmy but venomous tone, his fingers began to regain their strength, and I re-gripped the hilt of my sword again. "Aren't you going to finish me?" "Oh, now you're going to get me with that one. I skip on over, and you break me with your best counters to surprise me. Besides, just a simple love tap at the end of the fight wouldn't be a really fitting end to the duel. You think? I'll wait here for you to stand up. Take your time." So he could sense my plan to aim for his legs. Resigned, I put up a hand against the boulder behind me and got to my feet. In a duel, 6 feet might as well have been point-blank range. But even at this close distance, Morte held his round shield and hatchet loosely, carelessly at his sides. With not a concern in the world, it was not laziness of a superior position, but the confidence of experience. Thinking back, even before the duel, Morte had me outclassed in every respect. Battlefield position, use of the countdown timer, first strike, battle placement, tactics, hidden tricks up his sleeve, everything. He understood the way the duel and the retail version of SAO far, far better than I did. He might have had even chosen his character build for the express purpose of excelling in duels. Otherwise, he wouldn't waste a skill slot so he could use a redundant weapon type. At that point, my mind passed through its current deep, narrow valley, and my breathing caught in my throat. Morte was a dueling specialist. Could it be that leaving my HP just a tick above halfway was not a coincidence, but an intentional move on his part? Half strength, a duel ended as soon as either combatant's HP dropped below 50%. Within the safe zone of a city, any attack that occurred after the result of the screen popped up would automatically be nullified, and outside of town, extra damage would be classified as a crime, turning that attacker's cursor orange. But according to my hazy memory, the exact moment a duel ended was not when the HP reached half. It was at the point the normal attack sword skill damage had taken over half the opponent's HP. Meaning that if I had 510 out of 1000 HP remaining, and I suffered a single attack worth 600 damage, the duel would be over, but my HP would go to 0, killing me, and leaving the opponent as a legal green player. If Morte had left me just a bit healthier on purpose, he was not hoping to win this duel and force me to leave the quest for another day. He was planning here and now to kill me. A chill, colder than any ice, ran up my back, and just for a moment, I shivered. Sensing this, Morte's lips twisted upward as he exhaled a chuckle. It wasn't the first time another player had wanted to kill me. On the first night of this game of death, I had formed a brief pickup party with another player who attempted to murder me. His plan was not to swing his sword at me, but to have me killed by a summoned crowd of monsters in MPK, or Monster Player Kill. And before he used his hiding skill to disappear, he told me he was sorry. Of course, an apology did not excuse the act of murder, but at the very least, that partner of mine had made his choice bitterly to ensure that he received the anneal blade that would help him survive as soon as humanly possible. But Morte had no tangible benefit to gain by killing me. If I had lost in a duel, I was simply going to leave the infiltration quest for tomorrow. And even if I didn't believe in his promise, whether I completed the quest or not had no actual effect on Morte. Which meant he was a PKer in the truest sense. He killed for the sake of killing. It was impossible. SAO was inescapable, deadly trap. Morte had stuck in his digital prison just like the rest of us. If he killed another player in the group of clears advancing our progress in the game, he was only delaying the possibility that we beat the game and earned our freedom. Under that simple fact, the act of knowingly murdering another player meant that he did not actually seek to be free of this place. "You can't," I murmured, but Morte cut me off with another cackle. "Let's not have this conversation. Not when the going's so good. Show me something, Kirito. This is the end of the strongest man in the game, is it?" He held up his axe and deftly spun it around with 3 fingers. Even with that cocky show, there were no weak points to attack. If I rushed him at once, he would hold up his shield and finish me with a counter. If that counter had happened to be a sword skill powerful enough to deal over half my HP damage, I would die. There was a way to avoid the worst case scenario. If I resigned right away, I would lose the deal. But at least Morche wouldn't be able to avoid turning into an orange criminal if he hit me. He was involved with the DKB with some kind of plot in mind, and surely he couldn't stand for his cursor to change color. That was all wishful thinking, I knew. I couldn't acknowledge my lack of power and surrender in order to survive. I could aim to come from behind, victory. Find out what Morche was after, continue the quest, and salvage some measure of my pride. Sadly, if I chose the latter, I had no stock of plans or secret weapons to make use of. If anything, Morche, who was likely to have more up his sleeve, the overlooked one-handed axe actually became a bonus in a PvP battle. I knew that I couldn't recognize any longsword, scimitar, dagger, rapier, great axe, or greatsword skill just based on the initiating motion. But there were some one-handed axe and one-handed hammer skills I didn't even know the name of. In fact, since we'd started pushing from the start of the game, I couldn't name a single frontier who used a simple axe. Something prickled in the back of my brain. The way he flipped the axe around with his fingers. I'd seen someone doing the same thing before, recently, here on the 3rd floor. It wasn't during the strategy meeting in town. It was before that, when Asuna, Kismil, and I hid in the corridor of the Queen Spider Cave as a group passed by. Axe in his right hand and round shield to his left, the gray metal coif around his head. That description fit Mort into a T, and he had to be the same person. But that was impossible. The man I'd seen flipping his axe around was traveling with Cabal at the ALS. Just 7 or 8 hours ago, I saw Morche in the midst of Lynn's DKB. He did have the coif on, but no shield, and his weapon was a longsword. That's why I hadn't considered he might be the same person I'd seen with Cabal. The thought never occurred to me. That was the person I, and so many other SAO, saw player's main weapon and his defending feature. I was a swordsman. Asuna was a fencer. Agile was a double-handed axeman. And Morte was both a swordsman and an axeman. Morte was using a dual nature to moonlight in both DKB and ALS. He switched his weapons back and forth, helping with Lind and Cabal's quests at the same time. But why? It was the sheer altruism, an attempt to make good on his beta experience. If that was the case, was I just imagining the cold bloodlust I felt from him? Or was he hiding some true motive, even deeper, vaster, and darker than I could imagine? What are you? I whispered, in a voice so quiet even I couldn't hear it. Morte tilted his head in confusion. Feeling more up to it now? Don't worry, we've got all the time in the world. That's true, and the fight isn't over yet, I said, this time at an audible volume. It was perilous to keep fighting without a plan for victory. If Morte wasn't a good person at heart, it was quite likely that he would actually kill me. But my instincts told me that surrendering and leaving was even more dangerous choice. If I didn't get to the bottom of Morte's hidden intentions and discover his connections, something irreparable, awful was going to happen in the near future. Or so I felt.
That's right! That's the spirit! You never know how your hand's gonna play out until you turn over that river card. So, shall we get down to it? Flippity flip!
Time for the showdown then? I asked, brandishing my needle blade in front of me.
Very nice! Too bad we don't have an audience, though. It's showtime!
Mort blurted, raising his shield and holding his axe behind his body. We were only standing 6 feet apart, so the tip of my sword nearly touched his shield. The will of the battle rose into the two metal objects like an electric charge until virtual sparks snapped into life. And I moved. I leapt off my right foot, circling toward his dominant hand. Against the theory of shield combat, Morte spun to his right, trying to keep the shield facing me. I expected that response. In order to land a major sword skill, the foe needed to be knocked off balance, staggered. The quickest way to do that was with a normal attack, with a high staggering effect, but Morte couldn't do that. Use a minor hit would knock my HP below half, ending the duel. If he wanted to knock me into an open position, he had to deflect my attack with his shield. If anything, the fact that he'd met my flanking maneuver with his shield rather than his axe proved that he was trying to use the duel as a method of illegal PKing. The knowledge that any mistake could literally prove fatal was like a needle of ice in my brain, but there was no turning back now. If I didn't use all of my experience and ability, the worst would come true. Rah! I howled, raising my anneal blade high overhead. It was the exact same upper slash I attempted to no benefit right after Morte used his quick change trick, and with the added yell to boot. More confidently, raised his shield in a defensive position. The 2-foot wide wall of steel hid the venomous leer he wore. In order to ensure that the shield guarded an inflicted delay effect on the opponent, you couldn't just hold it up. It had to be a thrust out into a parrying motion. Just as the enemy attack struck, with his shield held before his face, Morte couldn't see my upper half, but he could see the top of my sword. Morte's every sense must have been focused on my blade, timing the exact moment the slash began. Even a tenth of his attention was anywhere other than my sword. If he wasn't planning on a perfectly timed guard, if he happened to notice the red glow suffusing from my left fist, I would die. Showdown. I thrust forward at the shield, not with my sword, but with my clenched left fist. The quickest of all martial arts skills, flash blow. At this moment, Mort's left arm would be relaxed, waiting for the right time to guard against my sword. The brief red uppercut hit the round shield along the lower left edge. A metallic shock echoed through the clearing, and the wall of steel disappeared. In battle, there were 3 bad things that could happen to a weapon or shield. Destruction, in which the item disappeared entirely. Snatching, in which the enemy stole it away. And dropping, in which the item fell to the ground. Attempting to cause any of these negative effects were known as a disarm attempt. In general, these attacks came from monsters. The lakeside swamp kobold trappers, halfway through the first floor, killed more than a few players by knocking the weapons loose into the sinking mud, then preying on the victims when they rushed to pick up the weapons. Players could attempt to disarm as well, but it was very difficult to pull off. You could either aim at the hand holding the weapon or attempt to hit the weapon directly on its side. But in either case, it would not work unless the weapon was held loosely. And the only time a player didn't have a death grip on its weapon was just before initiating an attack. Assisted by sheer luck, my flash blow caught that precise moment perfectly. The shield was ripped from Morchi's hand and was flying into the night air. The smile beneath that dangling coif was gone, and one of his canines glinted in anger. My shield disarm was successful, but it couldn't stop there. His HP bar was still over 90%. My experience in man-on-man combat was far inferior to Morchi's, but instead of that based on the quick change setting, he had 2 basic patterns: longsword with no shield and axe with shield. I hope that pushing him into axe with no shield helped close the experience gap. I had to start an attack that would take a little over 40% of his health away. If I couldn't do that, I probably wouldn't last long enough to win. But winning and losing and dying, these concepts were nothing more than distractions. Just move forward. Rah! With true roar of triumph, I swung my sword at his left shoulder. Morte leaned backward in attempt to evade, but at the end of my argumented blade caught his back scale mail, leaving behind a glowing red sign of damage. His HP was down 85%. Shah! He hissed, lashing back with his harsh hatchet. But all one-handed axe attacks swung with a wide arc that weren't handy in such close range. I ducked to avoid the hallowing swipe. The name Hatchet had made the axe sound small, but its thick blade dealt deadly as it brushed my hair overhead. Still on my crouch, I swiped his legs. The tip of the sword smashed against the shins of his boots. 2 quick whacks. It wasn't nearly enough damage to cause localized effects, but it was another 5% to his health. Even better, the blow to his feet caused Mort to stumble. I jumped up and assumed a sword skill pre-motion. Morte's axe momentum was still to the right. If he attempted another horizontal swipe, my skill would fire off first. But wait, Morte had overturned things I took for granted again and again. Perhaps my assumption that the heavy swing of an axe weren't meant for the ultra-tight range fell into that pattern too. I held my sword back from its position over my left shoulder. At the same moment, Morte's eyes gleamed from the shadow over his face. Sa! With a scream, his axe flew directly for my face, but no blade pierced. It was a square-based spike embedded in the pommel of the axe. The vicious backhand thrust came from much faster than the horizontal swing had. I gritted my teeth and pulled back my head desperately. The spike grazed my forehead and trailed to the left beyond the crimson light. Trailed by that attack, fixed my sight onto Morte's defenseless body. By pulling my sword just an inch farther over my left shoulder, the system recognized the initiation of a skill, and the blade kicked into a high-pitched whine, glowing silver. Rah! The anneal blade came down, nearly vertical, hitting Morte in his right breast. The blade instantly shot back into a high position and sliced vertically again, this time catching him deep on the left. Then it leaped once again, and deeper and heavier than before, buried itself into the dead center of his chest with a satisfying wham. There was 3-part sword skill I just learned 2 days before. Sharp nail. 3 vertical slashes glowed red into Morte's chest, like the claw marks of some gigantic beast. Just when I'd been hit his double cleave, his body shot through the air and landed on the surface of the water back first. The HP bar over his head rapidly fell, only to halt just a tick above 50%. I know that if I chased him down and grazed him with the tip of my sword, I'd win the duel, but I couldn't move forward in my current position. I'd concentrated so hard on this attack that my brain buzzed with a high-pitched whine, and my heart raced in my chest. Even Mortes lay prone in the water for a good 3 seconds, but he quickly jumped to his feet with an enormous splash and inspected his body. The 3 damage marks silently spit out little red blobs of light. Within moments, the spots disappeared and he looked up at me. 30 feet away, his mouth twisted, and I caught a glimpse of the gnashing teeth before the familiar leer returned. Well, I can see why everyone says you're the best. When you knocked my shield off, was that a martial arts skill people talked about in the beta? Good question, I replied, straight-faced. I didn't want to give him any extra information. Morte's grin widened, and he spun the axe in his fingers again. By the way, if I asked where you learned that skid, will you actually tell me? I was tempted to tell him the location of the bearded master, hidden in the mountains of the 2nd floor, just to see if he would go there and get the facial markings that didn't disappear until the quest was complete. But thought better of it. As long as you tell me who you practice dueling with. Morte's grin turned sour. Unlike martial arts, the ways of the duel couldn't be taught by an NPC. Morte, to have gained this much knowledge and experience with dueling, he had to have conducted an astonishing number of duels with another player since the opening of the retail version of SAO. And, if I had to guess, the player probably share the same scheme as Morte, who is splitting time between both DKB and ALS.
Why, of course love to tell you, he said, wriggling like a snake in the midst of the river. But the truth is, I practice on the creatures of the forest. I only know the basics, see?
Seemed like Lynn really took a shine on you. I decided not to mention Cabell's name as well. The ends of Morte's mouth curled upward, and he whispered, "That's not entirely true, but I do like him quite a bit. Anywho, we've only got a hot minute left in our duel. What's the plan, boss? Shall we wrap this one up?"
I think so. Our HPs are about even anyway, I growled. I mentioned remaining HP as it means to remind him that he wasn't the only one who could be attempted PK through this duel. Though it was a bluff, of course. Morte probably did mean to murder me, but I didn't have the conviction to kill another player, knowing it would be fatal, even against someone who intended me harm. As if seeing right through my bluff, the axe wielder shook his head, rattling the clanging change of his headgear, and grinned even wider. "Very, very good. I really admire about that you, Kirito. Besides, it's not a true fight until you go best of 3. So here goes the tiebreaker." He spun his harsh hatchet around a few times, held it at a diagonal, still standing 8 inches of water. He was calling my bluff or continuing the fight, even the threat of death over his head. In either case, there was no turning back. I lifted my kneel blade up again and into my customary mid-level stance. Directly top center of my view was the duel countdown, which ready 40 seconds left. As far as I could tell, our HP bars were at equal amounts. If I ran out, the victory would go to whoever had the most HP left. But it rounded to increments of 5%, so it would probably result in a draw. Morte certainly wouldn't like that outcome. He was going to come after me, and at some point in the next 40 seconds, I wrung the last of my exhausted concentration out to focus on Morte. Now that I had played my martial arts hand, there was nothing left up my sleeve, but I had no idea the same was true of him. Would he dart in at me at the inch closer bit by bit? In the next instant, Morte betrayed my expectations once again. He leaned backwards, held his axe high in the air. The crude blade took a turquoise glow, a sword skill, but we were over 30 feet apart. Even Sonic Leap, the longest range skill I was aware of, could not close the gap. Was there some ultra-long leaping attack available to one-handed axe that I didn't know about? I could dodge, defend, or move forward. For a half second, I couldn't decide. Half seconds that could have resulted in the loss of my life. But the duel ended in the most surprising of ways. Just as he was about to activate the sword skill, Morte's head spun to the left, as though drawn by a sudden noise. He lowered the axe, automatically disengaging the skill, and the turquoise glow despairingly into the air of the blade. I stood still, sword at the ready, while Morte held his hand up and waved it around. "Well, dreadfully sorry, but it looks like I'm a bit out of time prematurely." We still have 30 seconds left. Actually, you'd be surprised with how long 30 seconds can be. I mean, if you counted 1 for every second, it would take you 30 seconds to finish. He blathered, and then crouched and plunged a hand into the water at his feet. When it emerged, it was holding the anneal blade he abandoned near the start of the duel. He calmly straightened up and returned the sword to its sheath, as if he had known he would be in a precise spot in the water. Next, he walked a few yards upstream, picked up the round shield where it lay at the waterside. "Well, I've got to be off. That was fun. We should definitely try it again sometime." As he walked away, I managed to find my voice. "I assume that if we draw, you'll let me do the quest at the camp." Morte lifted his left hand without turning back and said, "Be my guest, but you might find it a little difficult, however." The duel counter hit 0, and Morte's retreating form was blocked by a large purple window announcing the results. As I expected, it was a draw. By the time the window vanished, the axe warrior was gone. After a few more moments with my sword raised, I finally stretched and relaxed. My first step was to pull a recovery potion from my waist pouch, pop the cork, and drink it down. Its flavor, like a Corolla, cherry juice spiked with chi, was not something I particularly savored, but it was a small price to pay for being able to recover full HP from a single bottle. Next, I trained my ears, but heard only the burbling of the river and rustling of the trees, chirping of insects, and far-off wolf howl. There was nothing out of place that might have suggested that Morte called off the duel. And what did he mean that completing the quest would be a bit difficult? Was he pretending to leave the duel only to sabotage my quest attempt after all? And why was Morte so insistent on keeping me away from the Forest Elf camp, going to the trouble of hiding and challenging me to do a duel? Now that it has ended in a tie, I couldn't get the answer to his plot out of him. On the other hand, at least I hadn't been killed. Ultimately, I couldn't decide what he was after. The result was a draw, but a fair observer probably had to admit that I'd lost. "I need to work harder," I muttered, putting my sword and sheath over my back. But the truth was, I felt resistant to training for PvP duels. As I learned today, even the half-finished setting could have fatal consequences. Whether it was legal or not now, that our lives were our lives, being experienced in PvP simply meant being skilled enough at murdering. I shook my head and let out a breath I'd been holding in my lungs, sucking in the fresh air. I could decide what to do about Morte's apparent duplicity in the DKB and ALS once I returned to the Dark Elf base and talked with Asuna. I couldn't completely rule out the possibility that he might simply be helping both groups out of a feeling of duty, yet, with one glance at the upstream direction, Morte's left, I spun the other way. A tall cliff loomed on the right side downstream, on the top of which could be seen the flickering campfires of the elves. An unexpected intrusion. It wasn't a very hard quest. I just had to climb the cliff, sneak into the leader's tent, and grab the orders off the table, and then descend the cliff. Wary of my followers behind me, I approached the cliff again. The slope at the side grew taller, and taller as I neared until they eclipsed my own height, when suddenly, "Who are all of you?" a voice bellowed, and I froze in alarm. Did one of the night guards just spot me? Even when I'm dozens of yards from the camp? I instinctively leaped to my right to hide against the bottom of the cliff. I looked around wildly, but didn't see any red enemy cursors. Next, I realized that the voice had come from quite a long way. Besides, I was alone. Why didn't he just say, "all of you"? So what did that mean? I slowly rose, popping my head just a bit over the lip of the rising cliffside, staring at the foot of the circular hill. On the opposite end, where I was hiding at the entrance of the path, wound uphill from the south. I noticed a number of silhouettes. There was a series of shouts that I couldn't make out. It seemed like 2 groups of 5 or 6 were facing off. It was probably teams of the Dark Elves and Forest Elves, perhaps another battle event, but the one that started the Jade Key quest. But as far as I knew, the infiltration quest didn't involve any sort of quest result. Curious, I stared harder at the grouped figures. My search skill kicked in and brought the distant sight into sharper detail, as well as summoning a number of colored cursors, barely thicker than tiny strings. A groan left my throat when I recognized the color of the cursors. What? They were all green. Both groups were players.